I'm recording the session, just so everyone knows. Welcome all to Imago Foundation for the Arts Artist Speak series. Today we are featuring Joan Hausrath, a local artist. My name is Yolanda Mazzoni, president of IFA, and I will be moderating today's program. At the end of the talk, we will turn it over for questions. As a reminder, keep yourself on mute. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat on the side. You can see the chat box on the bottom of your screen. And I'll read off any questions that come up. Now I would like to introduce Joan Hausrath. Joan grew up in Ohio and received an MFA in printmaking from Bowling Green State University and an MA in art history from Ohio State University. She has taught both at Ohio State and Bridgewater State Universities. In the beginning of her distinguished career, Joan created prints using the traditional process of etching. She then turned to fiber art after 15 years. During this time, her focus was designing and creating hand-dyed woven wall pieces, many of which are currently residing in several corporate collections. Joan returned to printmaking as her primary medium and pursued healthier process using materials other than traditional solvents, acid-based products, and investigating new directions in the field of alternate printmaking. After retiring from teaching in 2003, Joan moved to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where she maintains her studio. She exhibits regularly and teaches workshops in non-toxic printmaking. Her award-winning work is known for its technical proficiency, earthiness, and natural textures and symbolism. With that, I would like to turn it over to Joan. Joan's going to be sharing a presentation. So if you can take the screen.
Thank you, Yolanda. I want to thank you and the Imago Foundation for inviting me to share my career and the journey I've taken over the years. It's been a long career. I don't hesitate to disclose that I'm 78 years old, so we'll be covering quite a few years in my PowerPoint presentation.
Wonderful. We're seeing your screen now, Joan.
Can you see this?
Yeah.
Good. Well, I, at the age of 7, decided that I was going to be an artist. And here I am in 1949 in the 2nd grade. And coincidentally, this was the year that Crayola put out its first box of 48 different colored crayons. And I can remember the excitement of opening that box and seeing all those luscious colors and imagining all the creative things I could do with those crayons. And it's the same kind of excitement that I still experience today as a printmaker when I look at various materials available to me and consider the techniques, and I
want to come and look.
I can get excited about the possibilities of printmaking techniques. Would everybody please mute? Thank you. In school, I took every art class I could take all the way through junior high and high school. But I also had the opportunity, because of very supportive parents, to take Saturday morning classes at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I lived outside of Cleveland in a suburb, and I would hop on the bus every Saturday morning to go to the museum to take classes. And I started those classes when I was 9 and took them all the way up through high school. In elementary school, age students would meet in the galleries and sit on canvas stools with masonite lap boards and have lessons about something in the collection. In junior and senior high, we moved to classrooms in the attic of the museum and worked with a diverse series of media, paint, chalk, pastels, whatever. And I loved those classes. The classes ran from 9 until noon, and at noon, the classes let out, but my bus didn't come until 12:45. So every Saturday for close to 10 years, I had a half an hour to explore the museum collection. And this is the way to really get to know a museum, is in small doses over a period of time. Some days I would just wander from one gallery to another. Other times I would spend my time in a single gallery. I got to know the museum collection very well. And this led me eventually to get a degree in art history, as Yolanda mentioned, at Ohio State University. And a year after I received my degree, I took off for Europe for 6 weeks to see the art that I had been studying by way of photographs and books and slide presentations in classrooms. And I was eager to see the real thing. So I spent time in major museums and architectural structures in London, Paris, Rome, Florence, Venice, Vienna, and Amsterdam. And that turned me on to travel. Not only did I love going to the museums and seeing the artwork and experiencing the space of the architectural structures, but I love discovering the different cultures of every country that I went to. And I've been traveling avidly ever since. I first traveled to Europe and returned there many times, exploring not only cities and countryside and various regions. I also took students at Bridgewater State College on art history study tours for a number of years. And at a certain point, I decided I needed to see the rest of the world. So my first trip outside of Europe was to Peru, where I went to Cusco and Machu Picchu. And that set me off traveling the rest of the world. I've traveled extensively in the Far East, the Middle East, South America, Iceland, Africa. And all of this travel has in fact impacted my work as a studio artist, as you will see. So backtracking to, after graduating from high school, I attended Bowling Green State University, where I received a bachelor's degree in art and went on to receive a master's of fine arts in printmaking. And I gravitated to printmaking because I discovered I liked process. I liked the steps involved. I liked working with materials and the challenge of resolving an image that works with the technique. And my focus was etching. And an etching is made on a metal plate. I used copper at the time, and is a technique where acid is used to embed an image into the surface of the plate, below the surface of the plate. And it's achieved by coating the plate with a ground. And in this image, the black is a ground, a wax-based ground that's acid resistant. And the artist is drawing through the ground, exposing the copper. And when the plate is put into the acid, then the acid eats away the copper where it's exposed, and therefore embedding the image in the plate. And there are other ways of making marks on metal plates. One way was engraving, taking a tool and actually digging out lines and removing copper. Also, there's a technique called dry point, where a sharp pointed instrument is used to scratch the plate. And when I was in graduate school, my thesis were concentrated on using portable electric power tools. Excuse me, could somebody turn off their, please, silent? Excuse me, this is very distracting. Would you please all mute yourselves? Thank you. I was experimenting with power tools that had a rotary action that could be used with these various bits, grinding and cutting bits that would mark up the plate, or this electric engraver, which had a reciprocating action that punched the plate in a series of little holes. And I loved experimenting with technique. And I also discovered I liked reworking the plate. One of the ways to rework a plate is to remove an image that was embedded in it. And this is done using a scraper, actually removing the surface of the copper plate. And also burnishing, that is taking a tool, a very smooth tool, and with pressure, smushing the copper, moving it around and polishing an area to lighten the effect. So to print an intaglio plate, copper plate, ink is rubbed into all the surface grooves and textures and tones, and then it's wiped off. And when it's wiped, the grooves and the textures retain the ink, but the smooth surface is cleaned off and prints as white. And it is printed under pressure using an etching press that you see here, with paper that is dampened so that the fibers are molded around the surface of the plate. And a very exciting part of the process, of course, is pulling back the print and seeing the finished results. The advantage of using a plate that has an embedded image is that you can print an edition, that is multiples. They're all considered original works of art. They're not considered copies or reproductions. They're all hand printed one at a time. And this is a 16th century illustration of an etching press. It was made of wood, and etching presses today have the same mechanisms. They're just made out of different materials. They consist of a roller on top and a roller underneath. You can't see it in this particular case, with a platform in between called the bed. And the plate is put on the bed of the press with the dampened paper on top and cushioned with some felts. The upper roller is lowered to create the pressure, and then it's cranked through under this pressure. And when the paper is pulled back, the ink is transferred to the paper. So this is one of my early etchings. It measures about 15 inches wide, maybe 20 inches high. And I'm often inspired by nature, the textures and the forms, the shapes, I find quite fascinating. And I used every technique in the book to create this images. It has etching, it has dry point, it has engraving, it has power tool work in it as well. And another one in the same series, about the same size. And when I worked on these plates, I would take proofs of them. That is, I'd put an initial image on the plate and print it, and then go back and add more. So the work went slowly. And then I would make changes sometimes by scraping out an area, or I would burnish and lighten up an area. For instance, in some of these leaves, you see the tonal variation. Well, some of that is achieved by burnishing and lightening up the tone. You can see it in these leaves as well. In these leaves here. And I really liked working on the copper. Enjoyed it very much. And then about the time I moved to Massachusetts from Ohio, my parents moved to Florida. And this gave me exposure to the Atlantic coastline. And I discovered a fascination for seashells. Ohio doesn't have seashells, so I enjoyed exploring them as forms. And this is an etching. It's about the same size, 15 by 20. And then I did an engraving of seashells. This is more like 9 by 10. And here you can see engraving is cutting grooves into the plate. It takes a lot of pressure and the lines are very deliberate. So it looks much different than an etching. Very sharp and clear. And then I experimented with using a plastic that I could cut out. Instead of having a rectangular shape to the print, I just cut out various shapes of seashells. And I experimented with using solvents to soften the surface of the plastic so I could press textures into it. And then I also used power tools. It was an experiment. It was an experiment that didn't work very well. I was able to get just a couple of prints from these plates, but it's indicative of my fascination with exploring techniques. And then at a certain point, I decided to take a course at Rhode Island School of Design in weaving. And fiber art was not new to me. I have been crocheting and knitting and sewing since childhood, and handling yarns felt comfortable. And after taking a 5-week course in weaving, I went out and bought a loom. I just really got excited about weaving, and I backburnered my printmaking temporarily. Well, it turned out to be a 15-year temporary backburning of my printmaking. And in my weaving, I created wall hangings, flat woven wall hangings, and used a technique called warped face weave structure, where the intersection of weft and warp creates a structure for the weave. Only the warp shows in this technique. The weft holds the structure together, but you don't see it because the warp is so closely spaced together. And the technique I used was one of hand dyeing yarns, the warped yarns in gradations of different colors that interacted in really visually exciting ways. Now, I have to apologize for the quality of the slides because I documented these weavings with 35mm slides that don't convert very well to a digital format. But to dye the yarn, I needed to plot very carefully the design to begin with on graph paper, because every inch of warp consisted of 30 strands of yarn. And so I was grouping strands of yarn together. And for each inch, I was working with 2 different colors, which produced the horizontal stripes. And once it was on the loom and woven together and taken off, then some exciting visual things took place where the colors blended, where the colors created visual vibrations. And the dyeing of the yarn took the longest part of the process. Weaving it together went very fast. And I really enjoyed that combination of how I spent my time. And then I was approached by a fellow who wanted to commission a piece. And he was a landscape architect who specialized in Japanese gardens. And when I thought about Japanese gardens, I knew they were not formal, symmetrical arranged gardens. And so I looked at Japanese gardens and tried to absorb some of the design principles that I see in these images. And I discovered that empty spaces are very important in the Japanese aesthetic. And there's asymmetrical, of course, arrangement, but also very carefully placed focal points. And in a Japanese stroll garden, the pace that one walks through the garden and explores the various parts of the garden is determined by the footpath. Some of the footpaths are difficult to navigate, which slows a person down. And then there's open spaces where you travel faster. So there's a rhythm to the pace in exploring these gardens, and strategically located visual focal points. So that is what I used to design a whole new series of weavings where I applied these principles of open spaces and focal points that carry your eye across the surface of the form and aren't necessarily focused on the center. And then I got to a point where, after doing about 35, 40 of these weavings, I was repeating myself and I wasn't enjoying making these weavings. It wasn't exciting for me and I couldn't get out of that groove. I tried different weave structures. I looked for a different aesthetic approaches. And so I turned my attention back to printmaking. And when I went back to printmaking, I was reluctant to go back to using solvent-based products and acids because I had developed asthma in the meantime. And I didn't know how I was going to pursue printmaking until I ran across a workshop in using water-based inks in creating monotypes. And I wasn't sure this was the answer, but I signed up for the workshop and I became a convert. Monotype means that there's only one print. The image is made on a flat surface with no embedded image. So when the print is printed, you can't duplicate it. It's one of a kind. And the surface for printmakers tends to be a piece of plexiglass. And the ink is applied in various ways by rolling it on with a brayer, applying it with brushes, using various processes such as wiping back the ink, using stencils, drawing through the ink, and overprinting color upon color. And I discovered that this was a very flexible medium because you could apply the ink to the plexiglass, but if you made a mistake or wanted to change something, all you had to do was wipe the ink off. You didn't have a commitment that you would have if you were working directly on paper. And this convinced me that there was a big difference between working directly on paper, where once you put the watercolor or the acrylic paint down, you can't lift it off, and you just can cover it up. Whereas with monotypes, there were all sorts of flexibility in developing the image that I was eager to pursue. So here is one of my first monotypes. The image on the left is a full sheet of printmaking paper, 30 by 22, and the image on the right is a detail of the section in the center. And it was a whole different printmaking process than my etchings, which were very tedious and took a long time and were very detailed. This was a very spontaneous way of working. I could make a print in several hours rather than several weeks. And there was a spontaneity to the image making that I enjoyed, similar to watercolor. But I carried with me from my weaving, my discovery of the appreciation of the Japanese aesthetic. And again, I returned to nature for inspiration, and in this case, hollyhocks. Hollyhocks have a special place in my heart because one of my grandmothers had a big batch of hollyhocks, and as a child, I loved those hollyhocks. And in my own garden, I couldn't grow them. I tried many times to grow hollyhocks without success, so I decided hollyhocks I would grow on paper. This would be my garden. And the way I worked was to take a brayer with many colors, apply it to the plexiglass, and then take a damp cloth, because these were water-soluble inks. I could wipe around the edge and create a very crisp edge to the leaf shape. And as I was doing so, I was paying a lot of attention to the white shapes, the empty areas between the forms. So it was a positive, negative, back and forth focus as I was working. And the sparkles and white spots that you see here were achieved by just spritzing with water and dabbing at the ink to pick it up. So here are some examples of Japanese art that you can see where I received my inspiration. I was fascinated with Japanese screens and the decorative quality and the flatness of the forms. And you can see the gold as a negative area and all the gold shapes peeking out between the leaves and the flower blossoms. And the painting on the right of ink brush painting, the spontaneity of the form, the freshness, and the simplicity of the form. So I did about, in this series, I would say maybe 20 prints. And some of them became quite large. The one on the left is 30 by 44 inches. The one on the right is 22 inches wide and 5 feet tall. I would use 2 sheets of paper and join them to achieve that size. And then I moved on to tree trunks. And again, using the Japanese concept of wabi-sabi, where the Japanese revere the weathering of forms over time, the patina of aging, and the idiosyncrasies of nature's form. I didn't idealize these tree trunks, but I showed broken branches as they would occur in nature. I tried to imitate the feeling of moss and scarring of the bark and the textures of the bark and the aging of these trees, again, by manipulating the inks. And again, a reference to a Japanese screen with a gnarly tree. And I did, maybe 30 of these in a series. And this one measures 22 inches high and 5 feet across. And this one measures 16 feet across. I joined a number of prints together to create this installation. And in my travels, I went to Iceland, and I immediately came home and started working on a new series of prints. The landscape of Iceland overwhelmed me in its beauty, its majesty, its scale. It's a landscape that is treeless, so therefore you see the barren landforms at a distance. You see waterfalls miles away, and you see the forms created by volcanic eruptions and glaciers and ice. They call it the land of fire and ice. And you truly experience that when you're there. And so I made a series of 20 prints measuring 9 inches by 12 inches. And the challenge for me was to transpose the sense of majesty and scale in a very small print, capturing the essence of the landscape. And in the photograph on the right, this gives you an idea of scale when you compare the size of the figures to the cliffside beyond. And you can see the erosion of the cliff forming soil that sweeps down to the ground below. And in my monotypes, I could use that sweeping motion by taking a rag and wiping away the white and wiping into the black of the ink. While I was there, I did not experience a volcanic eruption, but I used my imagination in this case to create the sense of what an eruption might look like. But I did visit quite a few waterfalls. Another way that my travels have impacted my work as a printmaker comes from my travel journals. Over the years, when I traveled, I kept a written journal, a literary journal and every evening I'd write about what I experienced during the day. But oftentimes I get very tired, and one day I thought, I'm just going to map where I've gone. And I started drawing these maps, recording what I experienced, what I saw, and I began to make books as I traveled. Every evening I'd record my experiences. So what you're seeing here on the right is one of my maps of a day in Paris, where I started from my hotel, which was located near the Arc de Triomphe. I would walk to the metro, hop on the metro, and this particular day, I visited 4 different museums. And I created my own iconography of a series of symbols. And so on this page in this book, this was done in Vietnam. And here I illustrated a traffic intersection. They don't have lights or stop signs, and somehow traffic moves very smoothly, and there are no, well, I shouldn't say there are no collisions, I'm sure there are, but somehow they manage at intersections to keep both lanes of traffic moving. And the other sketchbook is of it's in Mexico, and it's bullfight where the matador is on horseback. Very exciting kind of event. Well, in my travels, I've been fascinated with discovering pictographs and rock art from all over the world. Some of these are from China, others are from Australia, the American West. And I've always been intrigued by these because, again, they're symbols that hold some meaning. But today we really don't know the details of that meaning. We can only look at these images and speculate the significance to the culture that produced them. And as graphic forms, they're really quite intriguing. And I saw a similarity then between my journal books and those pictographs and rock art. And so I started using them to create a series of prints that I called travel journals. So on the right is a print made recording some of my escapades in Java, where I visited temples and explored textiles and the countryside. And on the right is a small print that is one of my favorites. It records a day in Scotland when I was attending Highland Games. And this is the arena, the big circle. And within the arena, they were pole throwing and tugs of war, various athletic competitions. There was a stage with Highland dancers. And then this was the entrance. And at one point, there was all sorts of commotion going on and pomp and ceremony, and the Queen and Prince Philip were escorted in or were seated over here with Tony Blair and his wife. It was a very special day, and I'm very fond of that print. So the technique that I used to make these prints was very simple. It's called trace monotype. And I would apply ink to the surface of the plexiglass that I was working on, put a piece of paper down and draw on the back. And the pressure of drawing then would transfer the ink to the paper. And if I wanted to tone, I would just rub. Very low tech, no press needed. And so I continued to use this process for a series of prints. I made maybe 30 or 40 of these within my travel series. And this print right here, it depicts Lucca, the historic center of Lucca, Italy, as I explored a marketplace, as I traveled on top of the historic walls. I visited a cathedral, and on a pillar of the cathedral was carved a labyrinth, and so I included the labyrinth in my print. And this was the sketch out of my travel journal. On the left, the series of prints recording Japanese gardens that I visited in Kyoto. And on the right is a print recording several days of exploring San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. I spent winters in San Miguel for maybe 8 or 9 years, and loved the culture, loved the city, and returned many times. And so here I've layered map upon map to mingle them together, just as my memories of visiting San Miguel merge. And in San Miguel, I discovered how the Mexicans honor their indigenous heritage, their cultural heritage. They love fiestas, they love parades, they love celebrations. And many of these events are events where they dress up and wear masks in indigenous costumes and dancing, or just acting out stories. And San Miguel also has a wonderful mask museum, masks of Mexican masks of all shapes and sizes. And this inspired another series of prints, monotypes of Mexican masks. These each measure 9 by 12. Some of the images are done from sketches I did at the museum, and some of them I've taken artistic license and embellished and created some of my own masks. So I made 16 of them. You see them on the right. And on the left is a wall in my home where I display miniature masks that I have collected from all over the world. Excuse me. They're wonderful travel souvenirs that I can tuck into the corners of my suitcases, and I really enjoyed displaying them. I also found in my travels that I gravitated to museums that displayed prehistoric and very early ancient artwork. Just as pictographs have a fascination because they hold mysterious meanings, I romanticize over the meanings of these objects and find them fascinating in their simplicity and authenticity, and in their abstraction as well. And this started another whole series of prints based on archaeology. And if you'll notice this figure in the center, you see she inspired this print on the left. And I tried to capture the earthiness of these things because they were one point dug out of the earth, and the patina of time, the aging. And I was able to accomplish that with a technique called collagraphs. And on the left is a collograph plate, that test plate, and on the right is the print. And a collograph is made on a piece of cardboard with very thick modeling paste, gesso, thick paint, and various textures. It's essentially a collage. The black here is sandpaper. I use sandpaper here. I applied the paint to create various textures, and I think you can see in the print those textures. And it served as a wonderful technique for me in capturing the age of these historic objects. And so for me, again, having an idea and finding the appropriate technique is a challenge, and I love that challenge. So here we have a standing stone with rock art and a horde of objects down below. On the right, calligraph printed series of shapes resembling bones, and then trace monotype images up above inspired by objects unearthed by archaeologists. So these are the kinds of forms that intrigued me and that served to inspire these prints. These two prints are each 15 by 22. And again, I layered the imagery. I printed, in the case of the one on the left, the sienna color, then the black, and then I did traced monotype on top of that, introducing pictographs. The one on the right, these circular forms I discovered in rocks in Scotland. They're called cup and circle forms. Nobody knows what the meaning they have, but they're wonderfully decorative graphic marks. Here, the red in the background, I've used archaeological maps to introduce some linear work. And you might notice some of the textures are woven fabrics that I've glued down to the plate. Scruffy stuff, fibers, anything that creates a texture. So moving on to another series called Sticks and Stones. This kind of hails back to my intimate landscapes when I was doing etchings, looking at a section of a landscape, in this case, looking down at the ground and seeing a distribution of sticks and stones. I oftentimes used color in the background, achieved by printing a textured calligraph plate. And then the stones. The stones were printed on paper. I created papers that had stony colors and textures, and then I would select sections of the papers and cut out the stones and glue them down into the print, collaging them. But the real challenge was how to print the sticks. And it took me several weeks of experimentation before I found a process that satisfied my aesthetic conception for these sticks. And I'll explain that in a minute. So here are some of the prints in the Sticks and Stones series. Now, while I've been working over the years in my studio, I was also fascinated by what was happening in the field of printmaking in the last 30 years. And that is, artists were concerned about the health ramifications of working with acids and solvent-based materials. And printmakers were working in their own studios, coming up with alternative processes and materials, and sharing their experiments online. And there were many chat rooms that formed where printmakers would consult with each other and brainstorm about how to achieve a certain effect without having to resort to toxic materials. And one such artist was a woman in New York City who was teaching printmaking, and she was pregnant, and she decided she didn't want to use solvent-based materials. So in her kitchen, she created a water-soluble ink that she shared with her students. Well, the demand for these inks grew, so she started bottling it up and sharing it with more and more printmakers. And it evolved into a business for her where she began manufacturing it. And this happened with other printmakers. Also, printmaking suppliers were getting on board with some of these formulas and for grounds, for etchants, coming up with, finally, they realized there's a demand, so it made them commercially available. Also, other printmakers were turning to the offset printing industry. The commercial printing industry had also made revolutionary advancements in printing technology, where digital images were used and photographic images were used, and printmakers were experimenting with using these materials in their studios to facilitate hand printing. And this generated a whole new line of products, including this piece of plastic, a thin polyester sheet that you could draw on and print, or you could run through a photocopier and photocopy an image onto it, or print it from a laser printer. And you could use photographic images, and that's what I did with the sticks. It's printed using a lithographic process where the plate is dampened and it has a grain that holds a very thin film of water, and then a brayer with oil-based inks is rolled across, and the ink will stick only to the image, and the water will resist all the white areas. And that's what I used for printing my sticks. I took photographs of sticks, I put them into Photoshop, I made silhouettes out of them, printed them onto the plastic plates, and then printed them onto my prints. So I've been very fortunate to have the occasion to learn a lot of these new processes because I was awarded grants to study with some of the foremost innovators in these new processes. And also books have been produced during these 30 years introducing all of these alternative processes. And there are now even printmaking studios devoted completely to non-toxic printmaking. Here are some of the residencies and workshops that I've taken all over Europe and in this country, most of them grant funded because I introduced these processes to my students. And a year ago, in February, at the end of February, I took a workshop in electro etch at the Contemporary Print Center in Newark, Connecticut. I came back from that workshop, and as you all know, we had a COVID shutdown. So here I was isolated in my studio, having just studied this electro etch process. So I ordered everything I needed on Amazon, and I had a residency in my own studio last winter and spring that extended into the summer. And I experimented with etching on copper plate, but using electricity. And here are some of my test prints. Here is a copper plate with a ground on it. And it was easy to do. It was, I discovered, safe to do. And essentially the process is one where the plate is suspended into a copper salt solution with the ground on it, and facing it a couple of inches away is another copper plate. And the first plate is connected to positive, and the second plate is connected to the negative. And you can see that here, the red and the black, the positive and the negative. And so the electric current runs through the plate with the ground on it, and the ions of copper travel across and are deposited on the plate that's facing it. So what is happening is this plate on the right is electro etched, and the one on the right is electroplated. And so this is my most recent exploration. And I'm using stones as images. And this is one of my small prints. My setup is it has a container that's very small. So I'm using 6 by 6 inch copper plates. And I did a whole series of images of stones. I printed them up and then I cut them out. And then I've collaged them onto the printmaking paper. And in doing so, I've embellished some of my prints with embossing. So as I created these prints, which I call stone architecture, the one on the left is titled Fence, the one on the right is titled Arch. I feel like I'm a stonemason building structures out of these paper stones. On the left is cantilever, on the right is tower. And these measure about 13 inches by 18 inches. The one on the left is portal, the one on the right is wall. And this is my studio on the left. It's the studio that I've had for 17 years. I live in Pawtucket in a refurbished mill. And so it's home and studio combined. And the print on the right I made a year ago in response to what I was experiencing with this COVID lockdown. These images are 8 by 8. And this one is titled Stuck. This one is entitled Overwhelmed. This one is Anxiety. This one is Squeezed. This one is Isolated. And this one is Distancing. I think you can all relate. So, hope you enjoyed my journey.
Thank you. I'm going to try to unmute you all. Let me grab it, one moment. Unmute everyone.
Thank you, Joan. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Joan.
Thank you. That was great. We have some questions for you.
Okay.
All right, I'll finish just asking everyone to unmute. Mute everyone at the same time, but I can't unmute everybody at the same time. Give me 1 second. For those of you that have muted yourself, please unmute if you'd like to say anything.
Do we ask a question?
Yeah, let me ask the questions that were posted, and then we can go on to the rest.
To do that.
If we can start there. Okay, so the first question, if you can hear me okay?
Mhm.
All right, having tried many processes such as etching, monoprinting, and weaving, do you have a favorite, or do you consider each one equal and to the best suited for different subject matters?
My preferred medium is printmaking. I did do a detour into fiber art, but I would say I'm basically a printmaker. And as far as the type of process I use, it has to be compatible with the concept that I'm addressing. The idea that I have for the imagery has to be compatible with the technique. And discovering that combination is what is exciting for me. So I'll switch technique depending on what I want to say in my image.
Great. And if there's any follow-up questions as I'm going through this for the person that had sent it out, please chime in.
Thank you, Joan. Yeah, that was a good answer.
Okay. What is the printing process for monotypes? Specifically, how is the ink kept spreading under pressure without the grooves and other types of prints?
Well, with monoprinting, it's done on a flat surface. It's creating like a painting an image on a flat surface and then pressing the paper against it. There's only one of a kind. And there are all sorts of ways of applying the ink to that surface. You can even do finger paint, brushes, sponges, wiping, stenciling. It's up to the artist. I mean, there's no limit to the creative manipulation of the ink.
Great. Okay. Next question is, I know you said you took inspiration from Japanese gardens for your weavings. I was just wondering if these nature areas inspired you to weave nature-like subject matter, or would weaving detailed objects be too tricky for weaving?
I was never interested in tapestry weaving. I much preferred working with the interaction of color.
That was very interesting, the way you wove them together. The next question is, trees can take on a figurative aspect that relates to human form and also have metaphorical meaning. Do any of these things influence you when you explore tree images?
I suppose trees can have personalities just like humans can. And I can see that as a connection.
When you were talking about adding sandpaper to your prints, did you add ink? Did you put ink on the sandpaper?
When I use sandpaper in a colograph, I would glue it down. And then when I inked the entire plate, the sandpaper would hold a lot of ink and would print black. It was a very coarse texture that would collect a lot of ink. That's why I use the sandpaper.
Interesting. What was the solution for printing sticks in the Sticks and Stones series?
I used the polyester plates. They're produced by several manufacturers, but they're commonly known as pronto plates. And it's a lithographic process. But I tried collograph sticks. I tried several different collograph possibilities that just didn't work for me.
I know you like adding texture to your work and was wondering if you have tried jelly plates instead of glass or plastic plates. You put the ink on the gel plate and then push objects with fine details like leaves and veins and then lift them off before taking a print.
I've tried gel plates. In fact, I've made my own out of gelatin, and they're incredibly sensitive to textures. I did it a number of years ago, but I haven't returned to it, but who knows, I may find an occasion where it's the perfect solution for a particular print idea.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. I might like try it with gelatine as well.
And Courtney there had has left a link to jelly plates if anyone's interested in the chat box. See that there.
You have to refrigerate the plates, otherwise they get moldy and they don't last more than a week.
That's a good thing to know.
Another question is, are those stones from a photographic image originally?
No, I made them up. I went to Moonstone Beach in Rhode Island, and if you've ever been there, the beach is just covered with a wonderful array of stones. And I brought home a whole bunch of them, and they sit in my studio. But when I etched them, they were not photographic. I used grounds to define them, the textures and the forms of them.
Interesting. In the electric.
Excuse me, Yolanda.
Yes, go ahead.
I think there's someone that had to leave the meeting who's trying to get back in. If you could admit it. Thank you.
Jane. Okay, thank you for letting me know. Let me get back to the questions. In the electric etching, can you print from both the plates? I think I understand the etched plate is intaglio, but I'm not sure about the electroplated. Does it give you a reverse image?
No, it doesn't. It just collects a bunch of copper. It doesn't capture an image at all.
And the last question I had, if anyone else has ones live, is it looks like your weaving has much more color than your printmaking. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference in that and how you approach each?
Yeah, that's really interesting because all along my prints have been very restrained in color. And then all of a sudden, once I started weaving, wow, color dominated the form. And I love color, but I've just never been motivated to make colorful prints. I've done watercolors that are very colorful, but prints for me, I tend to really love the value contrasts and focus on texture too.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions?
Hi, yes, Peter Campbell.
Yes, go ahead, Peter.
Hi, Joan.
Hi.
some of your early etchings with the shells, the beautiful shells, and some of the grass and branches with the leaves, they were very detailed. Did you do any preliminary sketches first? And were you able to transfer your sketches to the plate? I know I've seen, a number of Rembrandts and Goyer and Duret, and I'm always curious on how some of their very detailed etchings, did they go directly to the plate? And the same with you. Did you go directly to the plate, or were you working off some preliminary sketches? Were you able to transfer those? How does that work?
Yes, I would start out with a generalized drawing, mapping out the composition of the major elements and transfer that to the plate. And then once that was established, I added the detail by working directly on the plate. I didn't do the detail. I only did the general layout of the composition and established that on the plate to begin with.
So were you able to transfer your drawing to the plate? I'm not sure how that works.
Well, once it had a ground on it, I would take tracing paper and draw with a soft pencil the image and put it face down on the ground and run it through the press, and the pencil marks would transfer to the ground.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Does anyone else have a question?
Joan, may I have,
Yes.
Joan?
Go ahead, Betsy.
May I show them may I show them the print you did of the caprese salad,
Okay.
Joan?
Yeah, sure.
Joan did this, we were talking about colorful prints. I'll see if I can show you this. I don't know if I can.
That print is an exception. It was a print I did for a Boston printmakers exhibit that was called Palette to Plate. And we were to do images of food and submit a recipe that went with the food. So I decomposed a caprese salad.
That's fantastic.
And I love it.
Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you. I love it.
I have one question. So you've worked with non-toxic, safer printing making processes. Traditionalists working with acids have sometimes criticized non-toxic methods, saying you can't get such good results. What are your thoughts about that?
I would disagree. In fact, you can get a whole array of new effects on plates using some of these effects that you couldn't get traditionally. Substituting acids today, a lot of printmakers used ferric chloride, which is a very high power salt solution that corrodes the plate in the same way that ferric hydrochloric and nitric acid would eat the plate. And I found with the electro etching, there's no difference. And I still print sometimes with oil-based inks, but I don't clean up with mineral spirits. I clean up with baby oil, which cuts through the ink. And then I wash the plates with Dawn detergent. So I work in a studio that I don't need ventilation.
Wonderful. That's great. Does anyone have any other questions? Well,
I do, please.
Oh, go ahead, Catherine.
So I just wanted to say first off, that was such an incredible talk. Thank you so much. And I really particularly love the stoneworks you showed at the end. I'm from Scotland. I'm sitting in Scotland just now, and they remind me of our dry stone dikes that we've got here, our walls, and the way they're kind of stacked together.
Yes. Yeah. I'm very fond of Scotland. I've been there twice, and I love the walls there. And it reminds me of Andy Goldsworthy, Stacking of Stones.
And I was just wondering, I noticed you'd done residencies in Edinburgh, and I was wondering if you had any plans to come back to Scotland and do workshops or anything like that.
I could be persuaded.
I'll get the spare room ready. Come way over. But thank you so much. That was incredible.
Thank you.
One more question I got. Where do you get your oil-based supplies? I have a hard time getting them around here, especially the acid in the ground.
I order online from printmakers, suppliers.
Well, Joan, thank you for this talk. It's been absolutely amazing. It's been wonderful to see your journey all the way and how you've developed over time and how one medium impacted another. So thank you so much for joining us and to Imago, and it's just, we love your work.
Well, you're welcome. I enjoyed the experience. And I do have a website at joanhausrath.com. And I've also started recording my travels in a travel blog, and there's a link on my website to the last several years of my travels. And once I'm able to travel again, I will be posting more. And thank you all for everyone who tuned in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.